I'm going to move on to a new topic in the faith education series of homilies. We're almost to the good stuff, I promise. But I will generally call this topic the last things. The last things, they're sometimes referred to as the four last things, is a term that's given to summarize four major topics. And those topics are death, judgment, heaven, and hell. And I'm going to throw purgatory and the saints into this category as well. They kind of fit here. And I plan on this being four homily series, this topic, but with a bit of a twist because we have a holy day coming up on Monday and Tuesday, the Feast of the Assumption. I will be talking about Mary and the saints on that day. So if you want the whole picture of the four last things, make sure to be here for that holy day, or at least listen to this homily some other time. So today, I thought I would begin this topic by the cheery way by talking about heaven. But first, we have to talk about a couple of less cheery things, and that is death and judgment. So the theological definition of death is the separation of one's soul from one's body. Our soul, once it's created at the moment of our creation, is eternal. It'll never end. According to St. Thomas Aquinas, he defines the soul as the, quote, first principle of life potential within a natural body. And in English, that means that the soul is what animates your body. Your soul gives your body life. While the physical material of your body is constantly changing by eating and by aging, your soul is permanent. You may have heard it said at some point in your life that you have a soul, but in actuality, you are a soul. Your soul is how you are identified and different from the rest of creation. It's what makes you unique. And that's why the four last things, death, judgment, heaven, and hell, depend on the state of your soul, because your soul is you. Physical death happens when your body is no longer capable of being a sufficient companion to your soul, either by age or sickness or physical trauma. Spiritual death is different, and that's something that we'll talk about at a later time. All right, so that's death. Now let's talk about judgment. This is what the Catechism says about judgment. This is paragraph 1021. Death puts an end to human life as the time open to either accepting or rejecting the divine grace manifested in Christ. The New Testament speaks of judgment primarily in its aspect of the final encounter with Christ in his second coming, but it also reportedly affirms that each person will be rewarded immediately after death in accordance with his works and faith. So what the Catechism here is telling us is that there are two judgments, or judgment happens on two levels. One at the end of the world, when Jesus returns to judge the living and the dead, and the second judgment is that each person will face what is called his or her particular judgment at the end of our lives. The Catechism continues, this is the next paragraph, 1022. Each person receives their eternal retribution in their immortal soul at the very moment of their death, in a particular judgment that refers his or her life to Christ. Either entrance into the blessedness of heaven through a purification or immediate and everlasting damnation. So what the Catechism lays out, there's basically three possibilities after death. Heaven through purification, which we call purgatory, heaven immediately, or damnation immediately and eternally, which is what we call hell. And we'll cover all of these topics individually, but today we're going to talk about heaven. So, first of all, how do you get to heaven? Well, the Catechism says this: those who die in God's grace and friendship and are perfectly purified live forever with Christ. So what does that mean? Well, dying in a state of grace means that we are in a relationship with God at the end of our life. And that essentially means that we have accepted a relationship with God, that we've not outright and blatantly rejected him. And that's a pretty generous level of qualification for heaven, if you think about it, simply not rejecting God and having some sort of relationship for him. He's very mercifully sets the bar pretty low for us to get to heaven, but we have to pay attention to the other part of the qualification listed in that definition that the Catechism gives us. It says that those who die in God's grace and friendship, so that's one qualification, and are perfectly purified, live forever with Christ. So what does perfectly purified mean? Well, it means that you're free from sin, and also you're free from any attachment or effect of your own personal sins. Some people do, in fact, meet these qualifications at the moment of their death for immediate entry into heaven. We call them the saints, and we'll talk about them in a couple of days on the Holy Day. But for those who do not die in the state of sainthood, there is purgatory, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. Purgatory is where our purification and preparation for heaven is completed. We've sort of cleared the bar, but we haven't gotten to the end of our journey yet, spiritually speaking. So that's death, judgment, and how to get to heaven. But probably the question that we all wonder is, what is heaven like? I don't know. I've never been there. But for most people, I would be willing to bet, especially in the modern secular world that we live in, that heaven sounds rather boring to them. I would be willing to bet that their notion of rising from the dead is far less interesting than what it actually is. Or, they probably think about the cartoons they saw growing up or whatever it was, that you're playing a harp, sitting on a cloud with a halo above your head, or even worse, you're praying the whole time. Like, what a drag. Who would want to be there? And there's some people who probably think of rising from the dead or life after death is basically just you get to keep on living, like you've been resuscitated by a doctor or something like that, or like Lazarus, when Jesus raises him from the dead, he just kind of goes about living his life again. But the resurrection, life after death in the resurrection is nothing like that. If you read the scriptures carefully, it is clear that Jesus' resurrection wasn't about just getting to live again after you die. It is about breaking into an entirely new form of life, a new way of existing that makes our previous existence seem like it was just a warm-up act. So after his resurrection, for example, Jesus is no longer bound by space or time. He appears in more than one place at once. Distance makes no difference to him. He can go where he wants to without anything being in his way. He travels where he wants. There's something mysterious about his appearance after he is risen, because he can only be recognized, even by his closest friends, only when he wants them to, only when he wishes them to recognize him. And yet, at the same time, he's human. He walks, he talks, he eats, and every single resurrection story, Jesus is eating something, it seems like. And he spends 40 days teaching his apostles, and all of that is possible because the resurrection is, it's foreshadowed by this life, but it's nothing like this life. It is entirely different than simply living on some more and living on forever. We will experience something entirely new. Now, I've done this before. I believe it was Easter a few years ago. I can't even remember why I did this, but I was talking about the resurrection, obviously, Easter. But anyways, so the best explanation of eternity and heaven that I've ever come across is in a children's book. The very last chapters of C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. If you're not familiar, the Chronicles of Narnia are about this, this sort of fantasy land that a series of children visit over the course of 7 books. So when I say Narnia, it's a location. It's like this place. And at the end, it's sort of like an allegory for the Bible. So there's a creation story in the beginning, and at the end, there's sort of a book of Revelation, and that's what this is. So I'm going to spoil the whole thing for you. But it's been out for like 70 years, so you've had enough time, I think, to read it on your own. But so there's going to be a lot of like names and animals talking and things like that. I'm not going to explain everything. Just listen to the imagery, because that's the important part that I think explains heaven rather well. "The eagle is right," said the Lord Diggory. "Listen, Peter, when Aslan is like Narnia's version of Jesus. When Aslan said that you could never go back to Narnia, he meant the Narnia that you were thinking of, but that was not the real Narnia. That had a beginning and an end. It was only a shadow or a copy of the real Narnia, which has always been here and always will be here. You need not mourn over Narnia, Lucy. All of the old Narnia that mattered, all the dear creatures, have been drawn into the real Narnia, and of course it is different as a real thing is from a shadow, or as waking life is from a dream. It is as hard to explain how this sunlit land was different from the old Narnia as it would be to tell you how the fruits of that country taste. Perhaps you will get some idea if you think of it like this. You may have been in a room in which there was a window that looked out on a lovely bay of the sea or a green valley that wound away among the mountains. And in the wall of that room, opposite the window, there may have been a mirror. And as you turned away from the window, you suddenly caught sight of that same sea or that same valley all over again in the mirror. Except the sea in that mirror, or the valley in that mirror, were in one sense just the same as the real ones, yet at the same time they were somehow different, deeper, more wonderful, more like places in a story that you've never heard but very much want to know. The difference between the old Narnia and the new Narnia was like that. The new one was a deeper country. Every rock and every flower, every blade of grass looked as if it had more meaning. I can't describe it any better than that. If you ever get there, you'll know what I mean. It was the unicorn who summed up what everybody else was feeling. He stamped his right forehoof on the ground and neighed, and then he cried, "I have come home at last. This is my real country. I belong here. This is the land that I've been looking for all of my life, though I never knew it until now." The reason why we loved the old Narnia was that it sometimes looked a little bit like this. Come, further up, further in. He shook his mane and sprang forward into a great gallop, a unicorn's gallop, which in our world would have carried him out of sight in a few moments. But now a most strange thing happened. Everybody else began to run, and they found to their astonishment that they could keep up with him. Not only the dogs and the humans, but even fat little Puzzle, the donkey, and the short-legged Pagan, the dwarf. The air flew past as if they were driving in a fast car without a windshield. The country flew past as if they were seeing it from the windows of the speeding express train. Faster and faster they raced, but no one got hot or tired or out of breath. We're going to skip ahead a little bit. They find the castle, and they go into the castle, and there's a garden inside the castle walls. And in the middle of this garden is another version of Narnia once again. And they go into that one, and it begins, pick it up again. About half an hour later, or it might have been half 100 years later, for time there is not like time here, Lucy stood with her dear friend, her oldest Narnian friend, the faun Mr. Tumnus, looking down over the wall of that garden and seeing all of Narnia spread out below. But when you looked down, you found that this hill was much higher than you had thought. It sank down with shining cliffs thousands of feet below them, and trees in that lower world looked no bigger than grains of green salt. Then she turned inward again and stood with her back to the wall and looked at the garden. "I see," she said at last, thoughtfully. "I see now. The garden is far bigger on the inside than it was on the outside." "Of course, daughter of Eve," said the faun. "The further up and the further in you go, the bigger everything gets. The inside is larger than the outside." Lucy looked hard at the garden and saw that it was not really a garden at all, but a whole world, with its own rivers and woods and sea and mountains. They were not strange. She knew them all. "I see," she said. "This is still Narnia, and more real and more beautiful than the Narnia down below, just as it was more real and more beautiful than the old Narnia. A world within a world." "Yes," said Mr. Tumnus, "like an onion, except as you go in and in, each circle is larger than the last." Then skipping to the last paragraph of the story. Lucy saw that a great series of many-colored cliffs led up in front of them like a giant staircase, and then she forgot everything else, because Aslan himself was coming, leaping down from cliff to cliff like a living cataract of power and beauty. And as he spoke, he no longer looked to them like a lion, but the things that began to happen after that were so great and so beautiful that I cannot write them. And for us, this is the end of all the stories. And we can most truly say that they lived happily ever after, but for them it was only the beginning of the real story. All of their life on this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now, at last, they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. So, people think that heaven is a place where we will stay forever. But heaven isn't a place, it's a whole new reality. All of the good things that we enjoy here in life are just a foretaste of the actual truth that we'll experience in the next. The next life is a whole new way of existing. The word forever, theologically speaking, doesn't mean a really, really, really long time, because there is no time in heaven. Eternity is a quality. not a quantity. It's something whose depths can never be exhausted, whose mysteries can never be solved. The truth is that people who think heaven is boring, well, those people are boring. Their idea of who God is boring. But God is always showing us something new and something amazing. He's always surprising us and taking us to places where we never imagined we could be. So to say that heaven or the resurrection simply means that you get to live again after you die, it's the biggest understatement in all of human history. The resurrection means that once you die, only then do you truly begin to live.